you very much. I'm Sally James from the Cato Institute. Needless to say, I've advocated abolishing the whole thing, let alone extending it. But anyway, my question is mainly for, I guess, Mr. Rosen or Mr. Bergston. Neither of you have mentioned whether you think TAA should be part of a package for, say, TPA extension or an FTA. Are you advocating what you're advocating regardless of if there's any further trade liberalisation, or would you like to see it linked to further liberalisation? Thank you.
Now, can I just, okay. So I'm going to let Fred answer the question of the linkage, because not only do we get probably different opinions, but it's probably more meaningful. I want to go back actually to say your opening. Sorry. I want to go back to your opening comment because actually, and I've said this publicly, other people can report this to you. Somebody asked me about your piece, and to comment on it. I actually happen to agree with you, and that's where I started. And that's why I want to make this clear. I agree that we should have a general program in this country. I want my general program to look like TAA. Some people want that general program to look like what we currently have. But I clearly want a general program. And it is only because that program is insufficient that we have had to go off and make these targeted programs. So I didn't feel that way 25 years ago, but I do feel that way now. So I just wanted to make that clear, because I think that's an important point.
On the linkage to trade liberalization, obviously I'd like to see current FTA bills passed by the Congress. I think it will be passed by the Congress. And so to the extent one could use the expansion of TAA office to help facilitate that passage and link the two, I'd like to see it. But I'd like to see these TAA reforms anyway, because, as Howard said, and Alan and Brad indicated in their remarks, there clearly is a downside cost to the globalization process. There are losers. There are adjustment requirements. It is, I think, quite legitimate morally and quite desirable politically to use some of the huge benefits the country gets from globalization to help those who lose from it. We've demonstrated that the U.S. is $1 trillion a year richer from the globalization process. We spend less than $1 billion a year to help the downside, the cost for losers. When those adjustment costs, by our estimates, total about $50 billion a year. We're very niggardly in paying an insurance premium to maintain the economy-wide benefits of globalization. I wish the Cato Institute would join us in that simple calculation, because I know your friends at Cato are among the strongest supporters in the country of free trade and liberalizing markets. Somehow they don't realize that there are downsides, costs, and losers that have to be taken care of if you're going to maintain the open markets and gain more from it, and I don't quite understand why.
Jacob Kierkegaard from the Peterson Institute. My question is to Professor Blinder. I want to take you back to the distinction that you briefly mentioned between what you call routinizability and offshoreability. I certainly appreciate, as you said, you've gone out on a considerable intellectual limb to come up with these, subjective estimates of offshoreability and what is contestable from the perspective of foreign competition. And I was wondering if I could lure you into making a leap of faith of maybe slightly smaller proportions, in fact, and come up with an estimate of how many of these types of jobs, both the 30 to 40 million that you mentioned as potentially contestable from abroad, but also more broadly, are actually contestable from routinizability, if you like, meaning actually has the potential to be fully automated. And I mean here I'm talking voice recognition software instead of call centers in India, because I would suggest that type of number would really be related to technological progress, and it would be much more difficult for people like Lou Dobbs and others to hijack such a number to use it for their own destructive agenda.
If I understood the question, the answer is no. But the reason is ignorance. I don't think it's not that it's not a good question. I think routinizability is another crucial aspect
and there's substantial overlap. That's what I meant by showing that Venn diagram. I just don't have a numerical handle on it at all, and so I can't. I'm sorry, but I'm not willing to hazard a guess because I could be off by miles. I just don't know.
Fred, first, thank you very much for this forum. This is really needed. Brad's paper is, I think, an extremely important contribution to the debate. I don't think we've had until now a considered, careful analysis of some of the arguments that Professor Blinder has been putting forward. I think he's sort of had a field day in the media with his idea, which certainly captures attention.
I could show you a lot of knives in the back also.
Which is in its own way rather dangerous. I think no matter how refined you have made your analysis, your efforts to parse out which jobs are offshoreable, it's still a highly mechanistic approach. And it ignores realities in the marketplace and certainly in regulation. I wrote you months ago about X-ray technicians. X-rays used to use an example that X-rays could be offshore, X-ray reading could be offshore. It can't be because of domestic regulation. There are about 15 people outside the United States who can read U.S. X-rays and have those readings accepted by U.S. medical institutions. Actuaries is another that you've used, but my friends in the actuarial business say that the regulation of that business is so determined that you have to be certified by various organizations, and in some cases you must work in the organization whose business you're certifying or whose risk you're analyzing. Same with accountancy. As in many professions, the states regulate them, certainly in accountancy. Yes, bookkeeping operations can be offshore, but what even medium-sized company, to say nothing of small ones, is going to go to an Indian accountant? Can't do that. Have to have an American CPA that's certified domestically, and you certainly want your partner and associates leading that firm to be near you and be certified. Similarly with financial analysts, and I think maybe the list is longer. A friend of mine, a financial analyst in New York, I said, well, you know, Alan Blinder says your job can be offshore. And he said, well, I don't see how. Because I've got to be talking to the companies that I'm analyzing all the time. I've got to be in the marketplace. I couldn't do this from Bangalore. So I think that those elements, the realities of the marketplace, to say nothing of the competitive forces at work in the marketplace, will determine offshoreability, not just assigning a value that you obtain, which you determine is subjective.
Yep. A few points. I want to again draw the distinction between offshoreability and offshoring. Regulation is one way to stop something that's offshoreable from actually becoming offshore. So, for example, it's not regulation, but it's almost regulation. In my classification, I put all government workers in non-offshoreable. I can assure you that lots of government workers do work that could, in principle, be offshore. But I think for political reasons, they're not going to be offshore. I put them all non-offshore. The X-ray technicians is dealt with, in fact, in a footnote in my paper, which says just what you said. But what I want to say also on regulation, regulations come and go and they can change. As the relative price of X-ray services soars as part of the national problem of having soaring relative prices of health care, that regulation may or may not, I don't know, but it certainly may change. And in terms of the actual equities, as you probably know, a huge fraction of the X-ray reading is actually traded internally. It goes from one part of the country to another at different time zones. Well, if you can do that, you can certainly send it to India, and the regulation may change on that, and similarly with lots of other things. So I don't think we should think of today's regulatory regime as immutable, and these things can change. The last thing I want to say is this is not a random sample, but as you noted, as Fred noted, others, there's been a lot of publicity around this work, so you get fan mail. You should see some of my fan mail. But on the following question, the fan mail is entirely one-sided. in any number of cases, in writing or in a radio interview or whatever, I said, such and such can be offshored, but thus and such can't be offshored. The fan mail is coming only in one direction. On the cases, several cases that I said can't be offshored, I get somebody, I'll give you one example. It came in civil engineering. I said, well, you got to be there and see the construction site. I get an email from a guy. This just shows how little you know about civil engineering, which of course he was right. He said most of this does not require anything remotely close to the site. There's not a reason in the world why it can't be offshore. And every one of my fan mail, I have not had one piece of fan mail saying, you don't know what you're talking about, there's no way to offshore it. Now, as I say, it's not a ring.
Fred, can I just say something? I'm a little humbled following up on Alan, but there's a difference between being able, offshoreable and being offshoreable and performed by a low-wage Indian. If there really are only 15 X-ray technicians, I may know them all because I know of large groups of American doctors who live overseas and read X-ray material in the middle of the night and then ship it back to hospitals in the United States. That doesn't mean, it can still be offshoreable. And no, but the way you're raising the issue is only in the case in which a job is being taken by some low-income, low-wage person. But the point is that the function can still be done, and that's why the regulation is there. There was one other piece. It also just... Yeah. Right. So American doctors who go overseas can do it. But wait, one other thing. It just so happens, I don't know much about service workers, but my brother is the president of the Enrolled Actuary Committee, Enrolled Actuary Organization. And he tells me that there is serious debate within their organization about issuing their test overseas. If that is the case, then it is offshoreable.
And I think we should be working to change the regulation. And instead of trying to raise impediments, we should be working to lower impediments. And I think that that's a key piece that's missing from this debate. It's the fear that's causing all to talk about raising impediments. We should be working to reduce regulation, get more common recognition of professional standards. It's going to make everybody better off.
Okay. More questions? Yes.
For Brad, I think there are a number of arbitrary decisions that are made in trying to identify what's going on and what is likely to go on. A number of the assumptions you made seem to me inappropriate in setting a numerical line for the income of the jobs that are likely to be offshored, and in the definition of what is an exporting industry. I have some experience with the auto industry. It shows up on your list as a major exporting industry. It's also a major importing industry, and it exports to Mexico because Mexico is a low-wage country, because it's part of its overall production. And the imports from Mexico in the auto industry are much higher than the exports. So there are lots of things you miss in the sort of definitions that you've set for identifying what's at risk and what isn't. I would also just note that CEOs in the United States are paid considerably more than CEOs in other countries, and so the wage differential would be huge in that case, but it would be well above the $40,000 limit that you set. And I'm sure that there's tremendous comparability and capabilities that CEOs in other countries would be able to perform.
I guess I'm not sure that there was a question in there. Yeah, what I presented here was a bit of a simplification for conversational purposes. Clearly, you've got increasing probabilities of facing import competition as wages decrease. Increasing probabilities of exporting as wages increase. So what I presented was fairly stark, but I still think that the notion, the intuition behind it flows through and is a meaningful contribution to this debate.
Okay, any final questions? Yes, lady in the back, and that'll be the last one.
Hi, I'm Sho Chandra from Bloomberg News. Just a quick question. In the analysis that various people on the panel have done, what is your, have you factored in stuff like, when I think Professor Blinder mentioned that, a surgeon's job is probably not offshoreable, but then you do have people who are willing and able to go to other countries, low-wage countries in particular, to get that service. There may be a lot of other services. For instance, instead of going to H&R Block and paying $100 to get my taxes done, what's to stop me from shipping the basic information to somebody overseas, getting the response, and then typing it in or, e-filing it myself and still saving part of the money? How much of an impact is that going to make? And, what are your thoughts on how that can be calculated or captured? Because how do you work out TAA for something like that?
My last question I don't think I can answer. To the basic question, I tried to estimate electronic offshoreability, meaning that the service provider and the service recipient were at a distance from one another. So that excluded things like what's called medical tourism. It is certainly possible. Medical tourism is like regular tourism, it's just for a different reason. I could go to France to sample the wines, or I could go for surgery or something like that. And the reason I didn't look at that, so that's not in my numbers at all. And the reason I think is that, unlike the electronic offshoring, it's very high cost, and that's sort of self-limiting. When the customer actually has to go to India to get the service, there's just going to be less of that than if the electrons can simply flow. And so that's why I looked at this side of it that I did.
Okay.
I have a quick follow-up to that. What about if you didn't have to go all the way to India, if you could just go across to Europe and it's cheaper? Do you think something of this kind of a trend is also going to become a bigger factor in?
Yeah, my answer is yes, but only a little bit. This is driven by technology and lowering transport costs. So it is getting cheaper and easier to transport a human across distance. But if you look at the difference in how much cheaper it's getting between that and moving bits of information, there's just no comparison. It's multiple orders of magnitude different.
Okay. Many thanks to Alan, Brad, and Howard. Many thanks to all of you for staying to the bitter end and going through the more analytical part of the discussion. We'll be hearing lots more about this. We have a meeting next week here on the impact of globalization on U.S. income distribution, a new book by Robert Lawrence. I think most of you are invited to that. We've got a session the following week with the 6 former USTRs and Susan Schwab, the current USTR, talking about with the U.S. trade policy. So this is the first of the series. We deliberately talk about TAA first because it is so central. Thanks to all of you for coming. Thanks to the panelists. Meeting adjourned.